we tend to favor ease of use, and that means don't get in anybody's way ever, which means everything's always wide open. And you take those wide open configurations into prod, and only after several months of enlightenment do you actually go, we probably shouldn't do that.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 167, How to Secure Kubernetes. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. Victor, you recently went to KubeCon. In fact, this is probably the second or third, I've lost track now, however many episodes we've done about KubeCon. But was one of the big items there security this year?
Oh, yeah. I think that if you go through exhibitor halls, I would say that 1/3 were security one way or another. And my theory is that now finally people start feeling comfortable with Kubernetes and cloud and all that stuff. And they're kind of, okay, so now we're not worrying anymore whether application can run in that strange place. So we can focus on other things. And that means security, among others.
And on today's show, we actually have someone that you met there, and go figure, he knows a lot about Kubernetes security. We have Lachlan Evenson on. Lachlan, how you doing?
Wonderful. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Did I get your name right?
You nailed it.
Okay, good. It's actually, that's your preferred name and talking name, but your name is actually even longer than that. So
it is. Lachlan.
I'm not even going to try that out. Okay, Lachlan. But Lachlan, you enjoy. Why Lachlan? Why not Loki? Sorry, different conversation for a different day.
Hey, we can go down that path too.
Okay, let's save that for the end in case we have time.
Absolutely.
Speaking of Loki, I'm walking a street with a guy called, my brain stopped.
I'm going to jump in.
Yeah. Anyways, walking with a friend, he says, do you know Loki? And of course, I love it. Kind of like, what the heck are you talking about? Yeah, Loki from Grafana. It's absolutely amazing. No, man, I'm going to take you to meet a guy who is going to pay our drinks. That's how we met. And he did pay our drinks.
That'd be me. Yes. At least I held up my end of the deal.
Hopefully you expensed it later, but that's a separate story, I guess.
Absolutely.
So that's how you met. You met at a bar. But, I mean, what's your day job?
Good question. My day job is I actually work as a product manager at Azure. And on Azure, I specifically work in the area of upstream in the cloud native ecosystem. And what we try to do is work in open source cloud native ecosystems and bring integrations and solve challenges in the ecosystem. So obviously I was attending KubeCon. I've been a long-time member of the Kubernetes community. I've served in many different capacities. I'm a CNCF ambassador. I served on the Kubernetes steering committee. I actually was responsible for the 1.16 Kubernetes release with a team that work on the releases. And so I've been a long-time member and user of Kubernetes. So naturally, you were talking about security. I think one big theme is now that Kubernetes has entered the mainstream, or many people are deploying workloads and solving problems with Kubernetes. How to actually address security is a big concern. So, I've been spending a lot of time investigating and then trying to educate on the security principles and tools available in Kubernetes.
Well, define security in Kubernetes. What does that really mean?
Which layer? Yeah, absolutely. And, let me just attack it from one, to use a pun, attack in security. From one aspect, I think what I've tried to do is break down the problem in how can we use the tools that are innately built into Kubernetes as a starting point, and help the community actually deliver default, secure by default configurations of Kubernetes. So what are the tools out there? How do you use them? How to demystify and make them really approachable? And I've actually spent, the last few months both writing and blogging and speaking about making Kubernetes secure by default. And that's been my quest. How do you actually use the tools out there and make it more secure? So that was the topic of my presentation, was using some of those tools out there.
Here's a question then for you. Wouldn't it be better that if Kubernetes would be secured by default instead of me making it secure by default?
Yeah, I think there's kind of back and forth, and I've even heard the terminology open by default. And I think, the biggest challenge out there is there are maybe misnomers or misrepresentation about the security stance of Kubernetes, or even an understanding of the different attack vectors and surface areas. Because as Darren was alluding to, there are many different layers in the Kubernetes layered cake. And which area of security you're talking about. And I think the area I've been focusing on is the security features that are available in the Kubernetes API that you can enable. I really would like to see secure by default, but that's really hard.
So what would be the common things? Give me low-hanging fruit. What are the silly things that I could do in 15 minutes and I was too silly not to do it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the easiest things to do in Kubernetes from a security perspective that aren't necessarily best practices are not configuring things like resource limits. That's generally a challenge with scheduling on Kubernetes and can cause a whole bunch of failure scenarios. I think just generally understanding what your container is trying to do and is able to do in, even single tenant or multi-tenant Kubernetes clusters. The other piece is just actually locking in what configurations you're able to make when defining a workload, for example, a deployment or a pod. Can I actually pull containers from any container registry? Can I expose a service on the internet? Can I have a privileged port open? There's a whole bunch of things that you can do very easily and quickly with Kubernetes, but there are some really great tools out there to make it super simple for you not to be able to do that, and a way that, a cluster administrator could have a set of policies that they'd like enforced on a cluster, and then your users, whether they're developers or operators, can actually operate more safely with some guide rails per se, to make sure that things don't go awry, or they're implementing security best practices.
When you said understanding what your container can do, that's very misleading, because I understood that my container in the past could mount a socket to Docker. I understood that really, really well.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. And technology has been built on the shoulders of that fact, right? and is kind of expecting that to be there. And, one of the things I spoke about in my presentation was the idea of this feature called pod security in Kubernetes. And it allows you to have different profiles that are predefined, which take into account all the security best practices. For example, there is a baseline, and there is restricted policies, and also there's privileged. So you can actually take a workload and apply a privilege policy, which means it has privilege to everything, and then start to work towards a baseline policy, which gives you security best practices, which says, hey, if your container might have access to unsavory things that you don't know about, we're actually going to stop you from deploying that workload and tell you what you need to do to remediate that. So, a lot of the conversation was around how to turn that on, and actually how to move your workloads over to be in baseline, or even even restricted. So applying the utmost standards to your workload. So, I think talking about these things and normalizing talking about security is a big thing. As you mentioned, Victor, getting security in your front brain and not making it an afterthought when you're using cloud native tooling is really where we got to get to as a community. And I think a lot of it spawns from, education and understanding of what tools are available and what problems they solve.
My main issue always with security, and I'm not talking about security as something we should do, because we should, but more like how it's implemented in companies, is that there is always that struggle between people who want it to be secure and at the same time preventing everybody else from being able to do things because it becomes too complicated. So what I'm really interested in is the tools in that space that are somehow doing the right thing without forcing me to abandon, the 3 weeks of a project and stop doing whatever I'm doing, which I guess are the tools that you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you said, it's one of the core tenets of using Kubernetes is having, as a developer or an operator, having access to that infrastructure and it not getting in your way of what you need to get done. So obviously, if you impart security best practices that slow you down, it's generally seen as a bad thing. So it's like you want to install kind of a speed bump. And I think, the opportunity that Kubernetes as a tool has is it can give you a couple of different options. And you mentioned doing the right thing on your behalf. So I think you've got some options in Kubernetes. You obviously have this option of admission controllers, and they can be in the path of all the requests, but they can do one or two things. They can either validate. So when you're creating a resource, they can pass back an error to the user and say, hey, you don't meet the conditions of this policy, and here's why. So then it's on the user to go fix them. You could actually allow it and throw an error. So just a warning per se. So I'll tell you that it's out of compliance and but I'm still going to allow you to create it. So next time you might learn your lesson and fix your pipelines. Or you can actually mutate it. So you could say, based on this policy, if I see a resource come in, I can change it on behalf of the user and actually bring it into compliance. So I think that's interesting. However, I'm kind of on the fence about that. I'd be interested to hear what you think. It's not declarative. In fact, it's kind of imperative behavior. So the goal is, you want to put everything into some CI/CD pipelines and have the tooling all be declarative from your source repository, and then push those artifacts and resources to a Kubernetes cluster or whatever infrastructure. So if you're modifying them in the path, so what the source or what's checked into your source control is different. Sometimes, that behavior can be non-deterministic. So, it's nice to be able to correct things on people's behalf, but I think the ultimate goal is to have them check in the actual resources that they want deployed so that you can get back to a known state.
Yeah, to be honest, I love admission controllers, the validation part, but I think that mutations are evil. I really, really, really don't like it. I mean, it almost doesn't serve the purpose in terms that you will never learn that you're doing something wrong because, hey, I will never figure out that I should write requests and limits if Mutator is going to put it for me, right? And I have a huge discrepancy between what I think is running in a cluster, like Git manifests in Git, and what is running in a cluster. So, I mean, there is a time and space for mutating webhooks. I'm not opposing them completely, but it's almost like last resort for me. What I would like to see is some kind of mutating webhook that somehow creates a PR in my Git repository.
And says, here's the changes. Yeah, no, that would be complete, full closed loop, which I think it would be interesting. And I agree that probably mutation is generally an anti-pattern, but I've also, done this long enough that, people in the ecosystem are on a spectrum of their journey, their cloud native maturity journey, let's call it that. And based on where they are in their journey, different tools can be applied in different ways. For example, you might start with, mutating webhook, which means your users don't change anything and you change it on their behalf. But slowly you could peel off and build the tooling because that cloud native nirvana where everything's checked into source control and you have, pipelines deploying it and gates where, people that have authority can approve or disapprove things to be pushed. Not many people have made it that far. And, we talk about the promised land, but we don't often talk about, how the concessions you have to make to get there. I think mutation might be one of those concessions. But yes, I agree that if you are cloud native enlightened, you probably shouldn't be doing it because it is a bit of an anti-pattern.
Yeah, I mean, companies start using mutating webhooks and then start slowly removing them one by one, right? Kind of over time. So if we over time adopt certain practices, I'm perfectly fine with that, right? As long as it's not the end solution, or until somebody comes up with my pull requests idea.
Yeah, I think you've put the bounty out there. Whoever comes up with that, Victor, will make you a happy person. But yeah,
my vote goes to Kyverno, folks. If you're listening, kind of like that's
there
the
you
next
go.
feature. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I don't think we talk in these these ecosystems enough about using a tool for its purpose at a time where you are in your journey, and the context of that journey matters. If I was to give another example, is I hear a lot of people, hey, Helm, which is a package manager on Kubernetes, doesn't do what I need it to do. And typically, I say, hey, Helm is great to get started, and generally you can package things up quickly. But if you want to do very complex code-based, object-oriented setup with your templates, and that may not be the solution. You may look to other solutions out there. I've seen Kepton and Kustomize and many others. But for wherever you are in your journey, it might be the right answer. So we often look at a tool and say it must be a Swiss Army knife to do, everything in this space. But I think, like microservices, we should say, hey, this tool does one job and it does it well. And I'm going to compose my, my Batman belt or my utility belt with many little tools. And, my security posture or my tool chain is going to be greater than the sum of the parts. So I'd like to see more of those conversations, because people bind to tools because they know them, but generally the context of where to use them sometimes is lost. And what ends up happening is the tools get beaten into doing everything, an okay job of everything, rather than a really good job of just a few things.
I remember like 20 years ago, whichever company I was working in, it was tempting to say, I'm going to buy one tool from IBM. It's going to do everything for me, right? But in the meantime, I think that we matured as in the industry in terms that nobody has those illusions anymore, right?
Yeah, I definitely still hear terminology like, single pane of glass and things like that. And, it's not necessarily a bad idea, but how do you, what is the recipe of that pane of glass? And can you change any one piece of the, the pieces that make that up? And I think composable and, I used to say when I was out running a cloud platform was change is the only constant and incremental revolution. So prepare yourself for change and set yourself up to always be changing rather than, always be fixed and connected to each tool doing one job and then moving through that life cycle.
But I do think that we are on the edge of actually, for the first time, getting that single pane of glass. It's going to be Kubernetes.
You think so?
But when I say Kubernetes, I do not necessarily mean as something that manages my containers, but Kubernetes API is something extensible that effectively you can create that single pane of glass with whichever components you want, and that pane of glass being Kube API, effectively. I don't mean single cluster. I don't mean everything is going to be container, but essentially, if you assemble sufficient number of CRDs, you get that pane of glass that is whatever you want it to be in a way.
Yeah. And you actually pulled on a thread here, Victor, that was one of my kind of biggest takeaways from KubeCon in Valencia, which was I had the opportunity to sit in on rejects and some of the pre-days. And there was a session by a gentleman by the name of Stefan at Red Hat. And he works on this project called KCP. Have you heard of this project?
Mm-mm.
So KCP is what if we, this is my TLDR. It's what if we took just the APIs from Kubernetes and we could create a way to stand up those APIs, but didn't ship all the workload controllers and nodes and all that. Just the actual API scaffolding, API server, RBAC, and a few other bits and pieces. And what if we use that to actually do interesting things? and specific work. Basically, Stefan showed this concept of workspaces, which were kind of an overlay on top of namespaces, and some tooling around. We could just create a set of API containers and CRDs without actually having the runtime and the controllers. So now we've got this very interesting idea where, as either a service provider or, I do a lot of work in the CAPZ space. Could I actually just host these APIs somewhere on a platform that has the API compatibility of Kubernetes, but doesn't have all the machinery required to run it, like nodes and container runtimes and all those bits and pieces? So now, we're going meta with Kubernetes. And I had this epiphany, I think I said to the person beside me in that session, is I feel like it's come full circle. Kubernetes is now Mesos, which is a framework for actually hosting very opinionated platforms upon, and you don't need to bring in, all the workloads and everything else, all the other concepts to Kubernetes. So it kind of, what is the evolution of Kubernetes came to my mind, and that was a very interesting play. So I'd encourage you to go, if you're in that space, take a look at the KCP project.
I already have it open and looking while you're talking, man. But yeah, I mean, I wasn't aware of that project, but I was already yelling at people for a while that I would willingly place a bet that Kube API is going to outlive Container Scheduler.
Yeah, and I think you should have placed money on that bet. I think, it's certainly looking those ways, and Kubernetes is having this other life that's coming up, which is Kubernetes without the containers, which is just a framework for hosting, generic APIs with some kind of, schema validation and other bits and pieces that's really extendable. So it gets rid of a lot of that boilerplate that we've come to love from CRDs in Kubernetes, and gives you kind of that controller declarative language with controller-backed implementation that I think, we're going to see the rise of this stripped-down Kubernetes, which is just API server plus a few different bits and pieces.
I'm thinking aloud. You still need to run containers to be able to run controllers, right?
Yeah, well, not necessarily. A controller can be implemented anywhere. Right, as long as it has access to the API server. Okay. Yeah, you could run it in a function. You could run it in a WASM module if you want to go do that. You could have a controller somewhere.
Yeah, true.
It just needs to have access to that API server. Now, you don't have too much of an opinion of how that runs, but that's, they're the questions that need answering. Oh, where does it run and how does it access and how do we build tooling around those things? So it's certainly a new frontier. But I was pleasantly surprised about that work and very interested to see where it goes.
Now you ruined my weekend.
Hey, I look forward to you digging in and letting me know. And I did put a tweet thread out about it, so you can follow along the cliff notes on my observations too, which I can send to you.
Nice. No, definitely. So, what else about security? What are the 3 silliest things that you saw people do? When I don't see you wear a hat. I don't know whether you ripped your hair or not when you heard them, but
absolutely.
More stories, yes.
Yeah, I think, the big ones are just container isolation and understanding, hey, when you download a container from, your favorite container repository, how was that built and what's running in there? And how does that operate? And, there's a lot of tooling around supply chain security, but just even what's executing inside there. So I see a lot of security happening at the Kubernetes API level. And then there are tools like Falco and eBPF in the Linux kernel specifically, where you can actually introspect what's happening at runtime and enforce some policy on that. I think that's a big area. So I feel like containers are open by default and you need to close them, plug all the holes. But actually having ways to do that in the Kubernetes APIs, I think, is interesting. And there's something called runtime class where you can have different container runtimes on a physical host. And then actually, based on the security criteria of your workloads, you can say schedule it with this runtime, which, may be nested virtualization as opposed to, container D running, some kind of container runtime on a node that's shared. I think that's a big scary place. I think the Kubernetes API itself is generally a lot of people have it opened up because Kubernetes nodes need to talk to the API. They need to have an identity, and identity management for access to the Kubernetes APIs is really scary. So locking that down, making sure you have some kind of identity, IAM access to validate that who you are and what you have access to, and binding that to RBAC. Generally, a lot of end users operate in God mode, or they have controllers that operate in God mode. And when I say God mode, they have elevated privileges that can do anything on a Kubernetes cluster. So if you compromise that controller or that user, there's nothing stopping you from deleting everything on that cluster, or worse, inserting things very quietly that people can't see. For example, you could add a mutating admission webhook and nobody would see it, and you could insert malicious code in the path. So I think locking down the Kubernetes API is number 2. So I think, runtime security, API security, and then just what can you configure in your workload resources? Where are the guide rails? What are the fields? When I started in Kubernetes, I think a pod specification may have had 30 fields. Last time I checked, it's over 300, and many of them are defaulted, so you never see them. But that's, 300, to the power of n number of different combinations you could have in security misconfigurations waiting for you to trip over. So I think, bringing guide rails and giving you secure by default in the guidance is really something we've got to work towards, in cloud native. Even Kubernetes is just one area, but there are many other areas in this ecosystem where we should be looking at how do I give users the right answer and which is the best practices built in and already turned on, and they have to selectively opt out. I think all too often we start with, let's give you the opinion lists system, and then you have to choose your own adventure as to how secure you want to be.
That seems really backwards, just stepping back and thinking about it. It should be, I understand why we do that, but it just seems insane to me.
No, totally. And I think, to go over into your world, it's like push-based, elevated privileges for CD systems is a big problem too. So how do we get from push to pull? And how do we actually take out these, single elevated places that have elevated privileges? So let's say, hey, I own all the Kubernetes configurations to get to clusters, and I have users in my CD system that have privileged access to deploy anything anywhere. You've got to get into that least privilege and actually look at, pull versus push, microservice over monolith, especially when it comes to like identity and access, because for all too often you end up with these massive source repositories that have code in them and services with elevated privileges that take said code from resource and then deploy to anywhere they like. And if you're somebody looking at this with a skewed eye, like a security or a hacker might, they're going to look at that and say, that's the bit I need to compromise because I can sit in there and nobody's going to know I'm there. And I have access to everything. That's the command and control. So I think, in the CD world, we got to talk about, how do you actually get from source repository to running environment, and what's the best security practices on that path?
That's when where GitOps kind of kicks in.
Exactly.
Right? When people ask me about, when we discuss GitOps, and usually people say, I like it because of this or that, but the only really important difference that GitOps brought from my perspective is actually that pool model. Right?
Yeah.
Everything that GitOps tools do, I could do with pipelines long before GitOps, right? I can have a job, a cron job even, that runs kubectl apply every 3 minutes. Git clone kubectl apply. But that ability to pull means that actually I can lock my cluster completely and unlock it only in the case of disaster. Kind of like there is no good reason why anybody should get anything but read-only access.
Yeah, no, I agree, Victor. And it's kind of the thing that nobody talks about with GitOps. It's kind of the, the star conditions apply. And it's like, hey, you're going to move to a pull model. And people look at the, hey, I have declarative and I can reconstruct the state of some running environment based on all these declarations I have in source repositories, which is equally as valuable. But nobody's looking at, hey, I'm actually de-risking my CD platform by changing the direction the information is being requested and actually compartmentalizing what runs where and what has access to what. So I agree. And again, it's many users are on that spectrum of they've come from, I have this big, massive CD instance that's running all my pipelines and has access to everything, like the big octopus in the middle. How do I actually, decompose that and move it to the other direction and have it broken down? I think that's actually a big security aspect to this whole, piece, because I think CD systems are still one area that you could touch on and actually have get access to a lot.
That's one of the conflicts or fights I had with Argo CD team. So Argo CD, I love it. It's a great tool, right? And then they were always telling people when they ask for best practices, hey, you can set up Argo CD in this one cluster, and it can actually deploy stuff, manage stuff in all the clusters. And I started freaking out. No, just run bloody Argo CD in every single cluster, because the moment you have a central Argo CD for all the clusters, you're denying it the main advantage, the pool model. It's not pool model anymore.
Yeah, it's, as you said, it's that balance of convenience over, security, and where do you draw the line? And it's up to each individual to answer that. But I think having more opinion in best practices, at least from a security perspective, and baking them in, I think we could do a better job about that, because we tend to favor ease of use, and that means don't get in anybody's way ever, which means everything's always wide open. And, you take those wide open configurations into prod, and only after several months of enlightenment do you actually go, we probably shouldn't do that.
That's the thing. I'm in favor of actually Kubernetes being wide open, and then putting the job onto vendors that are giving Kubernetes distributions to make it closed by default. Hey, core Kubernetes open. Whichever distribution we might be talking about right now, it's your job now actually to close it, and you give it to user and say closed. To me, that makes sense. Otherwise, if Kubernetes itself would be closed by default, then that would be a bit of a nightmare.
No,
right?
it's definitely a challenge. I think the interesting thing is every year, there are different security firms out there to say how many Kubernetes endpoints that are unpatched they can see on the internet. And that, that's the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night in a cold sweat, thinking these poor people don't even know that they've done that. And, all too often do the managed vendors actually figure out the best configurations and lock it down, but none of that knowledge is ever shared back to the community. And there are still a lot of people who pick up wholesale Kubernetes upstream and, run it on clusters, run it on their own infrastructure, even roll their own Kubernetes clusters on cloud providers. And it's like, who's socially responsible for helping those people, have an understanding and access to the right tools to actually help themselves have a better security posture? Because, when I see the front page of the news with somebody's been hacked, it's like looking in the mirror, right? It's a cold sweat moment of, that could be me, right? I don't kind of point my finger and say, oh, I'm glad that wasn't me. They messed up. I kind of go, it's very easy to configure things wrong. And it's very hard to configure things right. Is that, philosophically where we want to be? And are we doing, people justice by doing that? Because I think, we can do better. We could do better. And we could help people actually do better. So, that's kind of been my challenge and my call to arms for folks is, hey, I think we could have better security out of the box. And that presentation was about, you don't have to install the software or call a vendor. The software is actually baked into Kubernetes. You just need to know how to use it. And it's hard to make that pop because people don't naturally, discover that content without learning about it first.
Would an option for that be when you go, and this is specifically upstream, you get two choices. I install it unsecure or I install it secure. Could it be as simple as that?
I think it could be as simple as that. Yeah, absolutely.
Because I'm thinking, okay, when I spin up a VM today, I always have root access.
Right.
So that would be the unsecure model.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a basically easy button to get me to the here is what's secure as of this version, because in theory, that security posture is going to be changing over time.
Yeah. I think we could absolutely do that. And I think that's a great suggestion is, do you want the secure by default? But, as Victor said, that's left to the, up to an exercise to the vendor right now. And if you're not using said vendor, or that vendor doesn't have a big focus on security, it's kind of hard to see what you're missing.
And that's also only part of the story, right? Previous attempts of secure by default failed because they were not followed with certain level of education. Because if you secure it by default, the first thing I'm going to do when I run into problem that I cannot do something is to unsecure it, right? Kind of like, hey, yes, you cannot run root commands. I need sudo access and problem solved, right? Just being secure doesn't mean much unless you actually know how to overcome the issues that brings.
Yeah. And, that problem is as old as time, regardless of software, is the, how do you educate and how do you help people? People want to get stuff done, and they don't want necessarily things to be in the way. And sometimes security does stand in the way, and a lot of it's just about time versus energy to learn about how to do that. It's like, as you said, installing, a video doorbell on your front door, but leaving your door unlocked. Because it's just like, well, it's too much hassle to go and answer the door when somebody comes. If I leave it unlocked, people can then just walk in and put packages on the front of my stairs in my house. But do you actually get the point of a lock on your door? I don't know. Maybe that's an overly simplified, analogy there. But it's kind of, we have all these things in place to be able to provide different levels. But yeah, I think, talking about security isn't like a desirable thing that many people want to listen to or talk about, right? It's like, tell me the last time you got excited about security. And it's kind of just like, it's like doing the dishes, right? If you want to eat, the dishes have to be done. But nobody wakes up and goes, today I get to do the dishes. Like, great, right? Just like yesterday I had to do the dishes. And every day until, for the rest of my life, I'll get to do dishes. It's one of those things, but I think we could turn the table on the security narrative, absolutely, and make it a place to, lift each other up. And I think that's an opportunity for open source as well, as to make it the burden of many to talk about security rather than, hey, somebody in a room that their whole job is security and only those people know how to do it.
I'm actually in a camp of people, very small minority, that I think that the only way to actually be secure is to use open source. Mostly because
totally agree.
There are eyes on it.
Exactly. Yeah. A problem shared is a problem halved, for sure. And I think, security should be everybody's problem, and it should be something we think about early and first, just like we've done with, DevOps, right? It's like operations isn't just, hey, some ops person is sitting in the back room and their whole job is like, how can I take your code and make it run great? And I want to get woken up every night and look after it like a child. They're like, hey, if I bring the challenges of operations closer to the developer, maybe we can have a better conversation about making that a shared responsibility, even though we do have folks that understand some pieces over others. And I think security is undergoing that same kind of transformation. It's now just not some team in the back room that nobody wants to talk to and hopes they never come over to their desk. It's now, how can we take security into consideration while we're writing the code, not throw it over the fence for somebody who's scanning what your code is doing to come and tell you don't do that.
That's actually very true. At least I see it from the perspective of looking at different tools, vendors, and what they do. And I see a clear shift in how security-related companies are approaching it. In the past, the goal was to depress people. Here are 57,000 vulnerabilities that are in your system. And now there is so much bigger focus on, hey, you should do this. Kind of like security scanning of sorts or something like that actually guides you towards fixing the problem.
Oh, absolutely. And, I have that kind of maybe hopeless vision of the Friday, 0 day, the log4j, the next log4j. And, the last few have been, oh my goodness, where does log4j run? Am I vulnerable? Do I need to patch it? Is it fixed? All these questions are super hard to answer, and they ruin people's weekends and lives trying to fix them. But imagine a world where we had the right tooling and the right apparatus out there to actually answer that question very quickly and very easily, and you can go back to living your life and enjoying your weekend. So, I think those are that's the goalposts of where we need to be with all this technology is, I've done everything that I can, and when these things arise, I actually have a process that I can follow to actually resolve them rather than, very reactive processes now, which people are, I don't know, how do I quantify this? How do I get there?
Well, I think we want those goalposts. Those are the goalposts we have as developers. But I don't think that's what the execs' goalposts are. They don't care because, if it's going to take me another 6 months to make sure this is quote unquote secure to ship, it's just not going to happen. I'm going to ship now.
Yeah. And I have heard, that argument of, getting hacked is just the cost of doing business, right? So how much energy do you put into stopping that as opposed to, energy in, energy out?
I think that we are going through the same responses and cycles in every area, just something sooner than others. Exactly same comments were about testing. Not having tests mean that I can actually ship stuff instead of being locked in testing for half a year. We had the same conversation about infrastructure as code, that, hey, I'm not going to now spend half a year writing my infrastructure manifest, and so on and so forth. So it's just about taking a bit more time, I guess, but we can get there. I mean, many other things we are not questioning anymore, and we did in the past.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think, that energy in the open source community, there's the OpenSSF. There's some great tools out there. I think you did a session on your YouTube channel about Git sign. There's great tools out there, and you can start to stitch together bespoke solutions, and we'll see vendors crop up in the space, taking on this space. And I think we already see a few out there. So it's, it's an exciting time for security. And, the thing about security is there's no ending. It's always going to be, the fight between good and evil, and sometimes the good people get a win and sometimes the bad people get a win. But, it's worth doing. And I think, we got to get out of that meme of open source software is insecure to flip it to, proprietary software is actually less secure than open source software because of, as you said, Victor, there are more eyes, more reviews, more rigor in the process to actually do that. There we go. We get the siren on cue. I must have summoned it.
There we go. Exactly.
And that's actually a good cue because we got to be close to wrapping up because you've got another meeting to go to. I want to ask you a question that I asked Victor once he got back from KubeCon that he answered differently that I think you might. How many sessions did you go to?
I went to about 8. So during the main conference, I went to some pre-days. I went to about 8. I always make a point to try and go to several sessions. And maybe this is just me. KubeCon was definitely the return of the hallway track, KubeCon EU, and I think a lot of people just indulged in that. But I really like the way people phrase and solve problems. So, I look at different speakers that I've seen and look at different areas I have less experience in and take that as an opportunity just to sit and enjoy learning something. So I do go to and make a point to go to several sessions. So, and I really just appreciated, I sit through the keynotes for the same reason. And some people say, hey, I don't go to the keynotes, it's all the vendory stuff. But I like to get, my finger on the pulse and be able to talk about my observations through time. One of the things that I've had, the honor I would say is I've been to many of the KubeCons. I've even was at the first and I spoke at the first. So I've seen the arc of KubeCon over the years, and I still get excited for the same things that I did back in, late 2015 when the first one was in San Francisco.
And is Valencia greater than San Francisco?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
And Valencia was the return of KubeCon as I know it. So I was wondering, if it would get back because I felt like, San Diego was peak KubeCon, which was like the last one pre-pandemic, 2019. we went through the pandemic years, but I'd say it's bounced back, and I think Detroit's going to be amazing. So, if you're in that ecosystem, come to Detroit and check it out.
But that's the thing. Everybody's in that ecosystem. It's so huge.
It's massive.
That basically, whatever your interests are, it's somehow related.
Yeah. And I think that's the power of community, is to bring many different disparate groups together and find common interests, and common interests can connect.
So all of Lachie's information is going to be down in the show notes. Anything else you want to say, Lachie, before you leave us behind?
No, absolutely. I do want to just call out that I did listen to one of your last episodes where you reference Australians always being asleep because of Vegemite. And I do want to dispel and actually dispel that myth. And if you have ever tasted Vegemite, you definitely can't sleep after eating it.
No, I know. I have. People can't see here, but I actually have some Vegemite down in my kitchen.
Okay, well, there may be one show we all just do we'll have to send some to Victor, and we all just butter some toast and eat some Vegemite, and we film the reactions, and that's just, a YouTube short.
Bring it to Detroit.
Okay, I'll bring
Take
the Vegemite.
it to Detroit, and you guys, there you go. You
Excellent.
guys, I won't be in Detroit, but take the Vegemite. You guys can do a live stream from there, and I don't hate it. It's not my favorite, but I also don't hate it.
Yeah, no, I love it, but it is an acquired taste. And being, living in America and having American children, I taught them to eat Vegemite, much to my American wife's dismay.
I want to try it mostly I imagine it's one of those things that you need to do it once so that you can say that you did it.
Yeah, I think you need to do it like 3 times.
Similar to going to Vegas or Safari, right?
Oh, totally.
I got...
The best analogy is if you took soy sauce from sushi and let it harden into solid state, it just tastes very similar to like solidified soy sauce, I would say, is the best analogy. So if, salty kind of taste is your shtick, it might be up your alley.
And this, As the World Turns. No, that's a different show. Lachie, thanks for being with us today.
I really appreciate the time, Darren and Victor. It was lovely to meet you. I really appreciate all your efforts on the show, and I really enjoy tuning in. So thanks for having me.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.